It began with a single line on an internal palace entry list that almost no one ever bothers to read, a standard category code, a date, and a cluster of names that had no business appearing on an official morning briefing roster. The atmosphere inside the high-ceilinged conference room at Buckingham Palace was crisp and formal. Seated around the polished mahogany table were King Charles, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Anne, and a select group of top household courtiers. They had gathered to settle critical matters of institutional governance, residential security boundaries, and upcoming official schedules, confidential business reserved exclusively for working royals and their immediate senior staff. The briefing was barely 10 minutes underway when Princess Anne stopped looking at her agenda papers. Her sharp glance shifted toward the tall, double oak doors connecting the room to an adjoining restricted corridor. Through the narrow gap of the unlatched door, she caught sight of several figures standing in the private hallway, members of Queen Camilla's non-royal extended family, casually moving through a secured zone where no unvetted guest was ever permitted to linger without express clearance. Anne didn't interrupt the briefing with an outburst. Instead, she leaned toward her brother, her voice dropping to a low, icy tone as she spoke 6 words that froze the room. "Explain those people to me, Charles." Before we go deeper into the hidden palace mechanism behind this breach, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an insider update on the royal family. Stay tuned until the end of this series, because the single question Anne asked after this meeting halted changes everything we know about palace authority. King Charles's hand came up instantly, stopping a senior aide mid-sentence. The briefing room fell into total, uncomfortable silence. Charles's face hardened as he looked from his sister to the open doorway, his expression reflecting the sudden realization of a monarch who senses an administrative line has been crossed inside his own home. In a voice that left no room for debate, the king demanded to know immediately who had authorized non-official visitors into a restricted working sector during a confidential Crown summit. Queen Camilla stiffened in her chair, realizing the gravity of the situation faster than anyone else present. Anne wasn't making a personal point about family visits. She was challenging whether private privilege had quietly bled into sovereign space without the knowledge of the monarch or the heir. Prince William remained entirely silent, his eyes shifting from his father to his aunt as the full weight of the breach settled across the table. A senior courtier hurriedly stepped out to review the master entry log. 90 seconds of heavy, agonizing silence filled the room as 4 of the most powerful people in the country sat without uttering a word. When the official returned, his face was pale as he read from the digitized manifest. The access had not been granted under a temporary visitor pass. It was registered under a permanent household category code, a authorization that, on paper, read as if King Charles himself had personally signed off on standing, unrestricted access. The atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to cold, calculated interrogation. King Charles held the official entry log in his hand, staring at the designated category code stamped across the top of the manifest, Household of Their Majesties. To any staff member, gatekeeper, or security officer reading that line on a computer screen, those 4 words functioned as an ironclad, top-tier clearance, an implied direct command from the King and Queen that no subordinate would ever dare challenge or question. "I did not sign this," Charles said, his voice quiet but laced with absolute authority as he looked around the table. He turned his gaze directly toward his senior aides, expecting an immediate explanation. Instead, he met a wall of nervous hesitations and lowered eyes. Queen Camilla looked down at her hands, while Prince William leaned forward, pulling the duplicate copy of the entry sheet toward himself. As William scanned the dates and clearance protocols, a look of grim recognition settled over his face. For William, this was not merely an awkward domestic oversight. It hit a deeply sensitive nerve, tied directly to the history of the institution he was born to inherit. He had spent his entire life studying how palace machinery operated behind closed doors. He knew with painful clarity how subtle administrative adjustments could be used to manipulate access, grant unearned influence, or shield systemic favoritism from public and sovereign oversight. He had watched the palace bureaucracy manage and compartmentalize his mother, Princess Diana, decades ago, and he was determined never to let grey zone administrative maneuvers compromise his father's reign. William looked at the king and voiced the strategic danger in plain terms. This wasn't about whether Camilla's relatives were pleasant or trustworthy people. It was about the precedent being established in official institutional records. If standing security clearances could be generated under the sovereign's name without the sovereign's explicit knowledge, the entire governance structure of the crown was compromised. A precedent logged in a palace server doesn't disappear when people leave the room. It sits in the filing system, waiting to be cited by future generations as the established way of doing things. Princess Anne's eyes remained fixed on the administrative paper trail. Unlike standard visitors who required explicit clearance for every single arrival, this specific pass was designated as a standing authorization, an open-ended, perpetual pass that bypassed daily security checks entirely. It effectively turned non-working, private citizens into permanent insiders with unmonitored access to the private and working corridors of the royal estate. Anne flipped back through the preceding months of the entry log, her sharp eyes catching a pattern of quietly escalating privileges. She closed the folder with a deliberate, heavy thud that echoed through the quiet room. She looked past the courtiers, past her nephew, and stared straight at the king. She didn't offer a softened phrasing or a polite diplomatic buffer. Was this the first time? Anne asked, her voice ringing out like a judicial gavel. Silence blanketed the room, not the polite silence of courtly deference, but the heavy, suffocating silence of officials who know the truth is about to destroy a long-standing, comfortable arrangement. Charles looked away from his wife and stared at his chief of staff, awaiting an answer that no one in the room was eager to give. The moment King Charles formally suspended the royal briefing, the silence in the room disintegrated into a flurry of quiet, tense departures. Courtiers gathered their files without looking up, and Prince William stepped aside with his father to discuss the immediate operational security breach. Queen Camilla stood up from the mahogany table and walked out into the private residential corridor, her expression tight with suppressed frustration. She didn't return to her private apartments. Instead, she waited near the end of the long, portrait-lined hallway for Princess Anne. When Anne stepped out of the conference room, her leather portfolio tucked firmly under her arm, Camilla stepped forward to block her path. An aide standing 20 feet away discreetly backed into an adjoining alcove, recognizing that a decades-long dynamic between the two most senior women in the royal family had reached a critical flashpoint. "Did you really have to do that in front of the entire council, Anne?" Camilla asked, her tone sharp and defensive. "They are my family. They are not a security threat, and they are certainly not criminals." Anne stopped in her tracks. She didn't raise her voice or show a single flicker of emotional volatility. For 55 years, Princess Anne had operated under an unwavering, self-imposed rule. Personal feelings, family warmth, and individual desires must never undermine the absolute integrity of the crown. She had deliberately refused royal titles for her own children, Peter and Zara, ensuring they built private lives entirely separate from state-funded royal privileges. To see non-working, extended relatives moving through restricted operational corridors on a standing pass was, to Anne, an unforgivable breakdown of institutional discipline. She looked directly into Camilla's eyes and delivered a cold, undeniable truth. "Your family is not the question, Camilla. Access is." Camilla stiffened, the words hitting her like a direct blow. She tried to explain that the visit was meant to be entirely private, a simple matter of convenience so her children and grandchildren wouldn't be repeatedly delayed at outer security checkpoints when coming to visit her in her private residence. She insisted that she had never requested special constitutional standing or permission for them to walk near confidential meetings. "I was assured weeks ago that this was standard procedure," Camilla countered, her voice trembling slightly with mounting anger. "I was told it was a simple domestic pass so my family wouldn't be turned away at the gate. I was told that once it was entered into the system, nobody would trouble them again." Anne's eyes narrowed instantly as she caught the specific phrasing. Nobody would trouble them again? That was not the language of a routine residential gate pass. That was the language of a sweeping, unmonitored blanket clearance designed to bypass institutional oversight entirely. Realizing that Camilla had been given a promise that breached every standing protocol in the building, Anne took a step closer. The tension between them was no longer just about family pride. It was about who was truly pulling the levers of authority behind the king's back. "Then you were lied to," Anne said calmly, "or you heard exactly what you wanted to hear. Either way, it stops today." 20 minutes later, the heated argument in the public corridor gave way to a stark, closed-door meeting in a small private sitting room. King Charles had ordered the room cleared of all courtiers, private secretaries, and security detail. Only 3 people remained inside: Princess Anne, Queen Camilla, and Prince William. The atmosphere was heavy, but the anger had cooled into a sharp, forensic determination to find out how a simple domestic pass had mutated into an unrestricted palace clearance. Anne sat across from Camilla at a small tea table, the green leather portfolio laying open between them. She didn't launch into accusations. Instead, she began comparing the timeline of events. She recounted the private dinner 3 weeks earlier, where she had overheard a senior household courtier offering Camilla a seamless solution to her family's gate delays. Camilla nodded slowly, her defensive posture beginning to soften as the details aligned. She admitted to the exact conversation. She explained that she had merely complained about her grandchildren being held up at the outer security gates during informal evening visits. The courtier had reassured her that a routine administrative adjustment would fix the issue permanently, promising her that once logged, nobody should trouble them again. "I asked for smoother entry to my private residential quarters," Camilla stated firmly, looking directly at Prince William. "I never asked for my family to walk through working corridors, and I certainly never asked for them to be near a confidential briefing." Anne reached into the folder and pulled out the physical audit log. She pointed to the exact entry made in the palace digital system the morning after that dinner. Under the author's tag, the same courtier had logged the pass, but instead of limiting the clearance to the residential wing, the official had added a crucial 3-word annotation next to the expanded access scope, a practical simplification. With those 3 words, the courtier had unilaterally erased the boundary between private family quarters and official crown space. The courtier had used the Queen Consort's casual complaint to grant sweeping privileges, assuming no one would ever audit the system line by line. The revelation landed with sudden, dramatic weight. Camilla realized she hadn't just been helped by an attentive staffer, she had been used as an administrative shield by a courtier eager to curry favor and expand unauthorized influence under her name. For the first time since the briefing stopped, Anne and Camilla were no longer opponents in a royal rivalry. They were 2 senior figures, realizing that a middle-tier bureaucrat had manipulated both of them, compromising the king's authority in the process. At that precise moment, the heavy oak door opened, and King Charles re-entered the room. His face was rigid with cold resolve. He looked at his wife, his sister, and his heir, holding a fresh memorandum from the outer security gatehouse. Charles didn't wait for a briefing. He announced that he had just summoned the responsible courtier to his private study for immediate dismissal, and as he spoke, a radio crackled on a security console in the outer hallway. One of Camilla's non-royal relatives had just arrived at the palace gates and was, in real time, being politely turned away by guards under the king's direct, updated orders. The sudden enforcement of security at the palace gates sent immediate shockwaves through the royal household. As word spread among the staff that a relative of the Queen Consort had been turned away, the potential for a catastrophic public optics disaster loomed large. If leaked to the press without context, the story would inevitably be framed as a bitter, personal feud between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla, a narrative of dynamic rivalry that would dominate front pages for weeks. Inside the private sitting room, Prince William recognized that stopping at a single enforcement action was a dangerous half-measure. A rule aimed exclusively at Camilla's extended family would look like dynamic punishment rather than structural reform. It would leave a lingering wound inside the family and create a precedent that future generations could weaponize during the next reign. William stepped toward the center of the room, looking first at his father, then at his aunt, and finally directly at Camilla. If we leave this as a directive regarding one group of relatives, we fail the institution. William stated, his voice steady and resolute. The solution cannot be about who is liked, who is trusted, or who is married to whom today. It must be an absolute standard that applies to every single one of us. Camilla looked up, expecting another lecture on institutional boundaries. Instead, William delivered a proposal that instantly shifted the emotional balance of the crisis. He proposed a single, ironclad, palace-wide standard governing non-working extended family members across all senior royal households. To prove the policy was not personal, William explicitly insisted that his own family circle be placed under the exact same limits. Catherine's family, the Middletons, as well as his own children's private connections, would be subjected to the precise same access protocols, without exception, single-entry exceptions, or standing passes. The Middleton family has been part of my life for 20 years, William explained calmly. They are loved, they are trusted, and they are welcome in our private homes, but they do not walk through working corridors during official business, and they do not hold standing security clearances. That line protects them, and it protects the crown." Unquote. The depth of William's strategic vision struck everyone in the room. He was not isolating Camilla, he was putting his own family under the same restraint in front of her before anyone even asked him to. He had watched his mother, Princess Diana, navigate a palace system lacking clear written boundaries, and he was determined that no extended family member would ever be left vulnerable to accusations of political leverage or administrative privilege again. Camilla's expression softened as the defensive tension drained away. She realized that William was not trying to humiliate her children. He was dismantling a flawed system to protect the entire family. "I agree," Camilla said quietly, nodding toward William. "If the rules are equal for everyone, then no one can ever claim my family received something improper." King Charles looked at his son with immense pride, recognizing that William had successfully turned explosive family argument into a lasting act of governance. Charles agreed to issue the universal directive across the entire monarchy immediately. However, as Charles reached for his pen to sign the draft decree, Princess Anne held up her hand. She supported the policy completely, but she added one final, uncompromising condition that forced her brother to take total ownership. "You must sign this as the king alone, Charles," Anne said firmly, her eyes fixed on her brother. "If this decree looks like it came from William's prompting or my pressure, the press will call it a palace coup against Camilla. You must stand at the front of this decision, announce it as your sovereign standard, and own it entirely." By the following morning, the atmosphere across Buckingham Palace had shifted from private turmoil to disciplined execution. King Charles signed the official sovereign directive, establishing a single, non-negotiable security and visitor standard for every senior royal household. Extended relatives, whether related to Queen Camilla, Catherine, or Princess Anne herself, would continue to be welcomed in private residential quarters, but standing access codes and unvetted passage through working corridors were permanently abolished. When the brief, standardized statement was released to the media, commentators were stunned by its clarity. What had begun as an explosive, high-stakes confrontation in a closed briefing room had been transformed into an undeniable act of institutional modernization. The courtier responsible for expanding the access pass under the guise of a practical simplification was permanently removed from palace administrative duties, sending a clear message across every department that grey zone administrative favours would no longer be tolerated. Later that afternoon, the royal briefing reconvened in the very same high-ceilinged conference room. The attendance list was clean, precise, and verified. Seated around the polished mahogany table were King Charles, Queen Camilla, Prince William, and Princess Anne. The double oak doors leading to the adjoining corridor were firmly latched, and the hallway outside stood entirely clear. There were no lingering glances of resentment. Camilla sat with quiet dignity, knowing her family had been protected from ongoing public suspicion by an equal universal standard. William had secured a precedent that would safeguard his own future reign, and Princess Anne had once again proved why she remains the unyielding backbone of the monarchy, a woman whose devotion to duty overrides personal comfort every single time. King Charles placed his hands flat on the table, looked around at his family, and declared the briefing officially back in session. The boundary of the royal palace was exactly where it belonged. What do you think of Princess Anne's unyielding stand? Did she save the crown from a dangerous precedent? Or was Camilla's family unfairly caught in palace bureaucracy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. But the story inside the royal household doesn't end here. Behind closed doors, financial auditors have just uncovered a hidden series of estate transfers linking historical palace maintenance funds directly to private offshore trusts, and the senior royal named at the top of the ledger is going to shock everyone. You won't want to miss our next video as we expose the ledger that has Buckingham Palace on high alert.